President Donald Trump signing an executive order yesterday stating that the U.S. is to recognize only two sexes, male and female, on all government documents such as passports and visas. Western Mass News reporter Addie Patterson joins us live in studio after speaking with a local attorney about this order and how it could impact some local residents. Addie.
Chris, the attorney I spoke with says this new order can potentially pose a threat to certain citizens traveling outside of the country.
They want to classify people by either male or female, men or women, as opposed to other terms that had been widely used, such as they, them.
Just hours after Monday's inauguration, President Donald Trump signed an executive order proclaiming that the U.S. government will recognize only two genders, male and female.
And for people that have been identifying, for example, as they, them, that may be an issue.
The new executive order requires that the federal government use the term sex instead of gender and directs the State Department and the Department of Homeland Security to require that government-issued identification documents, including passports, visas, and global entry cards, accurately reflect the holder's sex. Western Mass News spoke with Northampton attorney James Winston. He says the president's new executive order shouldn't come as a big surprise.
There were ads that ran during the presidential campaign that said that Donald Trump is for you and me, and Kamala Harris is for they, them. So during his campaign, he kind of signaled where he was going.
Back in 2022, the Biden administration allowed Americans to be able to select the gender-neutral X as a marker on their passports. Now, Winston tells us those who checked X could be at risk of detainment when leaving and returning back into the country.
I think there's a risk now if you leave the United States with a passport, a global entry card that has an X for a designation for your gender. I think there's a real risk that when you try to come back, you may be detained until you have a card that conforms with President Trump's new executive order.
And while some remain worried about the federal government's plans, experts say there might be some issues for the president later on down the road.
I expect there to be challenges to this executive order, but where that goes remains to be seen.
This executive order also prevents taxpayer funds from being used for gender transition health care and mandates privacy in intimate spaces to ensure that single-sex spaces such as prisons are designated by sex and not gender identity. For now, reporting live in studio, Addie Patterson, Western Mass News.